Welcome to the Disrupt Your Career podcast, brought to you by Claire Harbour
and Antoine Tirard. We're passionate about helping everyone find fulfillment in their work life.
We believe that big, messy, uncharted career changes are inevitable, and it's up to you to decide.
Will you take control and disrupt, or allow yourself to be disrupted?
We wrote the book about it, and now we share here our conversations with other thinkers in this crucial area.
Settle down and get ready to listen to this dose of wisdom.
For this episode of the Disrupt Your Career podcast, we're hosting Avivah Wittenberg-Cox. Avivah is a CEO. She's a writer, a speaker, a coach, a consultant, a change agent, and all of the above, some of the above, depending on the call and the context. She's a global expert on 21st century leadership, gender and generational balance, longevity, and the future of work and careers. She's currently spending a year at Harvard as a 2022 Advanced Leadership Fellow, researching longevity, gender differences in aging, and how to manage individuals and teams through the third and fourth quarters of their 100-year lives. It's a tremendous pleasure to have you here with us, Avivah. Thank you and welcome.
Thank you so much, Claire. Lovely to be with you.
Fantastic. Well, let's get going with our classic first question, which is about your own career journey. I'd love to understand how you got started, the kinds of influence and choices that have happened along that journey, and most especially why and how you pivoted from the massive topic of gender to another huge topic of generations and aging.
Okay, a big foundational question, absolutely. Listen, I was born in Canada of a very inspirational mother. My father died when I was 3, and therefore my mother raised us of 3 kids. She was a Holocaust survivor. She'd emigrated to Canada. My father died just after they moved to Toronto. She didn't speak the language. She had 3 kids under 10. A BA and an MA when she hadn't finished high school and became a professor.
What a role model. What an act to follow.
I did it with joy and grace and beauty, which is a combination that, when you come behind that kind of person, you can't complain very much. Life is in contrast, the incredible lightness of being. So 2 things never occurred to me. 1, that I had it tough. That was just absurd. And 2, that women couldn't lead. That was also, and so when I left Canada at 19 and moved to Paris and stayed for 30 years, as you know, this whole topic of women and leadership came somewhat late. I was sort of mid-career. I was pregnant with my 2nd kid and got involved suddenly in founding a professional women's network because I realized that while I thought this topic was obsolete, around me, most people didn't, and companies and women were not really completely embracing their potential. So that got me started on a 25-year journey working on gender balance. It just seemed to me as an INSEAD grad, surrounded by sort of what I thought were rational business decisions, that I couldn't understand that people weren't looking at the data. And the data was really very clear that there was a massive arrival of talent, that GDP was growing all over the world, mostly because of this arrival of new, highly educated talent. And it was this massive opportunity that I thought was fun, interesting. And so that leads me to the generational switch. It seems to me just really clear that the next, I won't say tsunami because that's a negative word, but the next big demographic shift is the aging revolution. We've never seen this in all of human history. And suddenly we have a gender balanced world, and all of a sudden we have no longer a demographic pyramid, but a demographic square with as many old people as young people. We've never seen this before. We're not designed for it, not our systems, not our companies, not our own minds. It's almost a parallel journey. I feel like I'm back on the same road that I was on the gender topic. It's like, look, everybody, look at this data. It's unbelievable. There's this opportunity here, both to tap into the talent and also into this massive market of older people who are misframed, underestimated, and largely ignored.
You're right, I guess, not to call it a tsunami, but in terms of force, it probably has exactly that, doesn't it? So You've broken many barriers and been recognized and awarded for quite a lot of them. You were indeed, at the beginning of your career, a pioneering female journalist in Germany. You've been named a top 40 woman leading change, and you've received many, many other accolades. Of what are you the most proud, and what, in any aspect, is still left to tackle?
I'm not going to use the usual thing and say I'm most proud of my kids, although that's probably true, but I won't use that because that's the classic women thing. I think I'm probably most proud of having fairly early on recognized that this whole thing about let's fix women and empower women was a misframe. We should not be fixing the women. We should be adapting the system. I had that conversation with Sheryl Sandberg many years ago, and she was really just too young to hear me. And I think a lot of women are too young to hear this. They want help. They want coaching. They want special programs aimed at them. And it's really hard to hear that that's actually not a very effective solution. And I haven't entirely succeeded. I think the pendulum maybe is swinging my way finally. I've been on this for a long, long time, and the number of organizations, countries, and companies that have heard the message that it's time. I always say the 20th century was the rise of women, but the 21st century is the adaptation and or reaction of men and organizations to that rise. I think that remains true, and we're only halfway through that adaptation. And it's not clear to me that it'll be a net positive unless we really adapt.
So let's dig into that a little bit more and try to get to some structural answers or whatever comes to mind. But when we think about this long crusade towards a balance between genders in business, 50-50, ideally, looking back from where you started, where have we got to now? What improvements have you seen? And what remains to be done? And alongside that, what has struck you as you've gone through this journey from both a societal and organizational perspective and from the executives or leaders' perspective?
Listen, we've come a huge way. I always ask a room full of women, would they have chosen to be born at any earlier year ever in history? And usually the answer is no, right? And my short summary of that is, for the two of us, our grandmothers got the vote, our mothers got the pill, we got a great education and a good job, and I think our kids are hopefully getting shared parental leave, which I think is the next big issue. So I think those are the sort of systemic and technological adaptations that have enabled the rise of women, not necessarily the adaptation of men. And so I think what we're seeing, and you even see it when you work in organizations, leading organizations, I'd say the avant-garde, the smart ones, the really successful ones, the first movers, were really successful, I think, on gender balancing in companies. The intake now is very gender balanced. We've got a few problems getting women into the very top, even through the middle. Different companies have different issues, but certainly the rise of women in organizations is pretty strong, except in a few very particular sectors. So I think in a lot of organizations, it's older men are not necessarily very open to letting younger men become more gender balanced, more fathers, more hands-on, more flexible. I think a lot of boomer male leaders struggle a little bit with slightly more evolved millennial men, which is fascinating, right? And so that degree of how much they will unlock. And then I think it's overlapping with this aging issue. So ageism and sexism pile on each other. And there's a really interesting question right now is, are we going to lose all these over 50 women as organizations kind of in an ageist way nudge people out? Or are we going to actually harvest all the investment they've done now for a couple of decades and use women at their peak career years, which is 50 plus, I think. And again, the first mover companies are well on their way to doing that, but that's maybe like 10%, right?
If you're lucky. And I guess, one comment I wanted to interject is that presumably when you talk about companies and you're typically talking more about entities in the developed world as opposed to much of Africa, or the equity that we're aspiring to is maybe not as far ahead in some places other than the established business capitals of the world.
I always laugh because I think the Anglo-Saxon world keeps thinking it's way ahead on these issues.
You know, you're absolutely right.
You know, China is now getting less gender balanced, but it was much more gender balanced. Everywhere communism went, I mean, poor Russia. Russian business was run by many, many women in leadership. And Africa, I'd say, so, you know, there are an awful lot of African.
Awful lot of matriarchies, actually.
Awful lot of matriarchies, awful lot of women entrepreneurs who are driving economies. I mean, if you run through Nigeria, it's a lot of the. So yes, you know, there's a lot of male domination and things like that. But the reality of a lot of economic growth and performance is rooted in women. And I think there are generations to go. And it's not necessarily a constant road to progress, as we are sadly seeing now. But I think the example of what women are doing, the role modeling we see, the astonishing ambition and just talent of younger women now, it'll be hard to put back in the box. We can try. Some people will definitely try.
That's a hard perspective and absolutely worth calling out for sure. So if we come back to this, you know, massive opportunity to do something pretty amazing around over 50s, you know, you've got your cards on the table. They're new cards on arguably the same table. You've sworn that you're going to spend your next 2 decades on the balance between over 50s and under 50s. You've given us some of the reasons as to why that's important at this stage. What do you see as the challenges and opportunities around longevity and multi-generational workplaces in terms of both work and life?
A little bit like the gender topic, the longevity topic, even though the people in the longevity, there's a little club of people who've been in here for quite some time and they're passionate and they've been doing a lot of things and they think it's an old topic. In my mind, it's a brand new topic. It reminds me very much of where gender was when I started in on that 25 years ago. It wasn't like it was new, but it was really just hitting the mainstream awareness. And I think that's exactly where we are on longevity. It's just post-COVID, particularly what happened to older people during COVID, how unfairly impacted they were, how so many of us lost parents during that time, has made people much more aware of some of the age issues. And then I think, just as always, the data drives realization. And I think, as I wrote recently, there's a real demographic decline in a number of countries. The US, even the US, which is, you know, a heavy immigrant country, declining birth rates, aging populations. And in 2025, there's a real drop in number of young people, which is waking up places like universities who are counting on those 18-year-olds coming in, and there aren't any anymore. When that kind of data impact starts hitting, everything else follows, right? And so you can see that the older people have most of the purchasing power, most of the equity, most of the buying decisions, and you can ignore that for only so long. And you can try and aim all of your marketing sales at young people until that business begins to shrink.
So you've written this rather strong statement. The workplace will soon be balanced in 2 disruptive dimensions, gender and generations. They overlap. Are you ready? So what advice do you have for organizations in this respect? And even more importantly for our audience, what advice do you have for individuals? Let's even get specific. You and I are of a similar age, women in our 50s. That used to be a life sentence. What can we do to navigate, contribute to, and benefit from this new paradigm?
Okay, that's a really big question. So
how many hours do you have?
How many hours do you have? Exactly. Any company that didn't have a gender strategy has not gender balanced. If you think there's anything natural in organizations about these shifts, that they will naturally evolve, you're in for a surprise and you're going to waste a lot of time and money. And you could see that very clearly, right? Companies would recruit a lot of young women and then lose all the investment along the way because they didn't know that they had to actually adapt an awful lot of things. And the same on customers, right? If you didn't have a gender strategy to address women and their needs that might have been different than men and their needs, you were likely to be losing some opportunity to grow your business in that segment. And the same is true on age. Any company now that doesn't have a longevity strategy, that says, usually it's like, I'm gender blind, I'm age blind, I'm tolerant and inclusive of everything. Everybody thinks that. All over the world, everybody is very adamant that only competence counts, we're very inclusive. It just happens not to be true generally until you're quite skilled. And so just like on gender, I never thought about it so much as sexism, that you had to go in and do unconscious bias training. I'm not at all a believer in that, but I am a believer in, if you want to sell to the Chinese, you better learn their culture and their language, right? Well, if you want to sell to women, you better learn the language and culture of women. If you want to retain them, you better learn all about them and what they want out of life and how they manage their career cycles differently and how they talk differently. The same is true on generations. Generations are different. People say age doesn't matter. Age matters. Age matters. Life cycle matters. Stages matter. It matters for consumers. It matters for talent. And if you don't understand those differences, it's really hard to attract, retain, develop people. And that's what companies need to do. They need to get a longevity strategy. They need to think about this thing. The first thing they might want to do is measure internally what number of employees are within 10 years of retirement and how much knowledge is about to walk out the door. And if they are concerned about that, what kind of knowledge transfer mechanisms, retention, flexibility, keeping older people in on much more flexible work styles, all of this has to be explored, debated, and discussed, and understand what people want. And nobody's really on that yet, right? Age almost doesn't surface, except in a few partnership type firms, which is very funny. I mean,
where it's a very pressing issue.
Very and it's coming, right? I've been working with some law firms who are now run by the people who 20 years ago insisted that there were fixed retirement ages at 60, except now they're 60. And they're saying, but wait a minute, I feel great, I'm going to retire. For individuals, my invitation is, and you know this from the podcast that I run called 4 Quarter Lives, is to really think and start planning more mindfully for a 4-quarter life, where each quarter has its own developmental task, ego-driven requirements, financial needs. And it's basically, 0 to 25, 50, 75. And 100, if many of us are going to be pushing on to rather older ages and health spans. And so I think the earlier we integrate this reality as individuals are a little ahead of companies in terms of thinking about this stuff. There are more individuals moving on this. We began to understand that you have to plan financially, you have to plan physically, what you do in Q1, how healthy you are, whether you smoke or not, how you eat is actually going to have an impact on how you age. And we're beginning to know that. And I think for the Q3 question that you were asking is, what should the 50 to 75-year-olds be thinking about? Really, the issue is we should have known about this better in Q2. Ideally, we would be right now, as Q3ers, helping Q2ers pace themselves, to relax a little bit, to have families, to enjoy them a little bit, to breathe, to not burn out, to not stress out, to realize that there is now 50 or 60-year careers, that you can do different things. You will have multiple lives, multiple careers, maybe multiple marriages and personal relationships. And that you can just take a bit more time, right? Which is not the current mantra. And I'm just writing a blog based on a book I have just read, which is very sobering, called Overtime, that whether or not people are consistently at work and employed in their 50s is a huge predictor of whether they will be employed and active in their 60s. I'm not saying that work is, the be all and end all of everybody in life, but for many of us who want to stay engaged in contributing in a variety of ways, this book says that 50% of Americans are not consistently employed in their 50s and therefore struggle greatly to continue in their 60s. So I think the wake up for a lot of us, including me, is don't slow down. Don't think that because you're sort of heading towards 60s or whatever you're heading towards, is a good reason to slow down. I'd almost say the opposite. It's time to really lean in if you want to stay in the game, stay relevant, keep learning, keep growing, keep networking, keep meeting new people and new ideas.
So it sounds as though what you're saying is it isn't necessarily a question of keep on doing exactly the same thing at the same pace, but it's keep engaged, keep active, keep exploring, stay curious. I mean, I can't remember what science backs this up, but curiosity keeps us alive, not least because it stops us from getting eaten by the snake that's crawling down the branch just next to us. But yes, that's wonderful.
I'd almost say don't keep doing the same thing. I think that's one of the dangers. Yeah. You're in some kind of rat race and you keep spinning on your wheel. I think Q3, the invitation of 50, and then even more pressingly 60, if you haven't done it at 50, is change. I think the 50s is a time that the Q3 generally, Q2 is a time of building, achieving, growing, getting your feet into whatever was imprinted on you by family and culture. Q3 is a call to yourself. It's a much more intrinsically driven time of life. You can start letting go of other people's expectations and needs. You usually have done a lot of your caring responsibilities, and you can start looking at what really do you care about, that drives you, what imprint you want to leave on the world. And it's a fantastically generative, exciting time if you give yourself time to breathe and eventually redesign.
Creativity only happens in space anyway, doesn't it? It doesn't happen in busyness. So those are some wonderful pieces of advice. Let's turn back to organizations. You've worked with and coached many CEOs and boards and excos, and call them what you want, with a focus on helping them to balance their businesses. What have you learned along the way of that journey? What convictions have you formed beyond those you've already shared with us? And what are the characteristics of those few and blissful leaders who are successfully creating balance in their organizations?
One of the joys that I've always found in this topic is that it was always the smart ones who got it. The smart, open, enlightened leaders and organizations. So I didn't realize this when I created this business, but it was pretty self-selecting in terms of the companies and organizations I got to work with. And I got to work with some of the best because they were always first on all these topics. They get it. They get it faster than others. They're data-driven and rational rather than being rather emotional or defensive or in denial about these topics, which I always laugh because they say women are emotional. My God, if you've ever seen a bunch of men talking about gender issues, let me tell you about emotions. They run high. If you lock up men in a room for a day, which I've done many, many times over the last 15 years, and have them talk about these issues, they are far more open than we give them credit for. But they are completely unskilled. And we don't leave room and space for them to skill up. So I think there's a lot of pressure. They have pressure at home. They have pressure from their wives, from their daughters, from their stakeholders, shareholders, from the media. They don't want to say the wrong thing. There's a lot of mistakes have been made. People have embarrassingly ended up on the front page. They don't like that at all. And so there's fear and political correctness and misframing that gender was made a diversity issue, one of my pet peeves. And so I think so many people talk about empowering women in order to gender balance. I've always recognized that actually what we need to is empower leaders, no matter what gender they are, in order to help them understand gender differences and lead across genders and sell across genders. And that more positive construct really opens people up, and they're wildly enthusiastic. And I'd say 95% of the leaders that have been most effective pushing gender balance in their organizations that I've worked with have been men. They're really good at it when you give them a less accusatory stance to run with. And that the most progressive men among them, because I worked with some extraordinarily progressive CEOs, also recognize that their male colleagues may not be where they are. and that they need a little bit of time and space to get the emotions out, to learn what it really is. And a lot of this is not helped by a lot of women saying it's a women's issue and let's create a women's network.
Yeah, the othering isn't generally helpful, is it?
Othering, siloing, pointing. And I always say, if you can replace the word women by the word Chinese in what you're doing, you're probably okay. If not, you're probably doing something a little unfortunate that's not going to deliver.
Fascinating. You're currently shifting your gears. You're spending a year at Harvard researching longevity and gender differences in aging and how to navigate this fantastic transition into third and fourth quarters of our very long lives. These themes are summarized in your latest graphic book. I love your graphic books, Thriving to 100 Through Life's Four Quarters. Tell us more about why you enrolled in the program and decided to explore this topic in an academic setting. And what would be your pitch for us to buy and read your book?
Well, the book is a 3-minute graphic read, so it's not like they have to read anything, right? You just have to admire the pictures. I like the graphic books because you get all the messages of a big book in a 3-minute picture book, right, for grown-ups. So that's my pitch to all of our graphic books available on our website at 21st.com. And why did I come to school? It was my 60th birthday gift to myself. During COVID, I had gotten very interested in this topic and had really started doing a lot of the research and writing on Forbes and HBR in terms of this. I had done some online work called the Midlife Rethink, where I'd had this program of helping people at this stage. And so I had learned a lot about it. And I thought that this was kind of walking the talk on my concept that we should really lean into Q3. And so I said, okay, I will seriously take some time to step back, think, explore this topic, explore it in a good place in one of the pioneering programs in the world, Harvard's Advanced Leadership Initiative, started by Rosabeth Moss-Kanter, who is a role model of my entire career, and see how Harvard did it. I did a little 3-part series online. Harvard did a 1-year program. And I had been exploring different programs. There's also the Modern Elder Academy. There's something called Saging International. I'd done a lot of these different online programs. And it was partly that I wanted to explore what I call transition mechanisms. What's the best way? What's the best place? What's the best program? What's the best length of time to get people through this midlife transition, equip them for the pivot, and send them on their way in a safe community of peers who have a similar level of appetite and curiosity for change. And one of my goals is also to spread these programs more globally. When I started, Harvard was the first, then Stanford came in, and then there were a bunch of American schools doing this and very little abroad. I'm happy to report that Oxford is launching in January 24. The University of St. Gallen in Switzerland is next, and I'm hoping to talk to a whole bunch more over the next few years to see if we can't really spread this kind of thing and normalize it.
Wonderful. Let's go way back in age and think about what advice you would like to give to 18-year-old Avivah, if you could go back to her.
Gosh, it's tough. 18-year-old Avivah, well, she kind of had it because she went to Paris when she was 19 and then never looked back. Young woman in a big hurry all the time. I graduated university at 19. I was in a rush. I had to do everything really, really fast. My advice today would be to hunt more actively for mentors, people who would give me advice that I would listen to. I think my mother was a powerful role model, but I think it would have helped me to understand the world and be more supported. I'm always incredulous and envious when I hear young men say, and so saw me and picked me and took me under his wing and showed me it's like, what? And so I think that would be my advice, both to myself and any young person, is find a whole bunch of mentors, not just one, in different places, different backgrounds, different cultures, to peek under the covers of how the world actually works. I'm not sure I still understand. I'm routinely shocked by how the world actually works. And there are people who know. And so the faster you can connect with them and learn, I think would have been comforting and helpful.
Wonderful. That's a beautiful universal piece of advice, I guess, that applies equally to women as to men. It's not just about Avivah. Oh, it sounds as though she needed to slow down, possibly.
She's still done.
You're still here and doing amazing things. So it didn't do you too much harm in the long run, I guess. But yes, this idea of going and seeking mentors. And I think just to mark this for the audience as a whole, we often get questions about, well, how do I go about getting a mentor? And I think one of the most important things to think about here is that you can have official, assigned, signed in blood sort of relationships with mentors, or you can just have people from whom and to whom you go for some advice sometimes, and not getting too tangled up in, can I make a contract with that scary older person to be a mentor, but just having the courage and the curiosity to go and ask the questions of the kinds of people who might know a bit more.
And I think young people routinely underestimate the interest that older people have in being asked, and in younger people just generally. And I think this whole Zoom revolution and the COVID pandemic has accelerated this no end. Is almost nobody says no to a 30-minute Zoom call. All you have to do is reach out and show interest, some degree of knowledge.
Don't be lazy. Do your research first, I guess.
Don't be lazy on the outreach. Read the damn book before you ask people about their books. But I think then you're just never going to get a no, right? I think very few people will now say no to that kind of giving forward. And I signed myself up for that list. I'm open to any 30-minute call with almost anybody listening.
Goodness. Well, thank goodness for you that you're not being listened to by millions of people on this podcast, because that could be an interesting multiplier. But yes, I think that's incredibly sound advice. And we humans are hardwired to enjoy curious questions from other people, whether they be younger or older. We're flattered by it. So it can be a very positive experience for us as the older ones who might be seen as the mentors, but also curiosity about what's going on with that younger generation and how we can all collaborate to make the world a better place is also an added bonus in saying yes to those 30-minute conversations. So yeah, all you young listeners, it's not as difficult as you believe it to be. You're telling yourself a story, and the story's not true. So ask.
And I'd add that not just for the young, but for Q3 listening. Yeah. All these people over 50 or in their 60s are wondering what in the world. So it's a lonely, let me just underline that I think the 60s, 50s, 60s is a lot like the 20s. A lot of self-doubt, a lot of shame, a lot of confusion. And you don't know that you're going to be like that because you're grown up. You're supposed to know what the hell you're doing. And when suddenly you arrive at a place where you don't, and you're deep into self-questioning, and you think you're the only one, let me just tell you, you're not. We are all in this. And it really helps to have somebody like Claire Harbour asking really intelligent questions so that you can start thinking about where you want to go next. And it's not an easy transition. So I just want to make sure people understand the 20s is no easy time these years, but nor is the next big transition, which is this midlife one. And they both require, I think, communities and transition mechanisms and coaches and any kind of help that you can grab onto will really facilitate your journey. Don't try and go it alone.
I was going to say, the less we're alone, the more we have confidence in having recourse to others, the better our lives and the world in general will be, for sure. So just finally, Avivah, I know I can hear and sense, and you've alluded to the fact that you've got many exciting projects coming up. Would you like to share one or two of them? What's going to be on your horizon for the next 12 months or so?
Oh, well, I have a book to write, like we all do, right? So I will be spending 2023, I hope, actually writing this new book on all of the topics we've just talked about. So the 4-Quarter Lives. I've got a new podcast called 4-Quarter Lives that you can get on any platform that is alternating between experts in the longevity, future of work, aging space with role models in all the quarters, actually, to revisit what each of these quarters is really about today and how much Q3 in particular is a new time of life that we have to explore and people don't know about. I'll continue Probably with my Sunday Elderberries blog, which is a much, much more personal voice than I've ever written in. So if people want to hear me self-questioning, that's where I tend to do it. And I still will write my Forbes columns and do my usual running around. There's a lot of corporate work in this space that I might not have much time in 23, but 24, I will refocus a little bit on getting the message out into a broader corporate space.
Wonderful. Well, it's been extraordinarily interesting having all this insight from you. And whether you're focusing on third and fourth quarter or not, then there is something in here for first and second as well. And so I know this episode is going to be absolutely adored and appreciated by the audience. So thank you, Avivah, for joining us.
Thank you, Claire. Yes, no, I do think one of the great gifts of Q3 is actually for Q2, that they can realize life does not end at 50. And I'd say in particular for women, it only just begins. So thank you for having me. I know, but you don't know that until you hit it. So
indeed not. Well, with that, we're going to call an end to this podcast and just say once again, thank you.
Thank you, Claire, for having me. It's been a delight.
We hope you enjoyed hearing from this month's guest as much as we did.
Do go and check out our work on disrupt-your-career.com and come back soon. Thank you.